So REST is simply a URL-based or HTTP-based language methodology for doing data exchange. So if you've done web services programming in the past, you're used to constructing a SOAP envelope, for example, and passing it off to the service that then processes that envelope. You're calling a specific method and passing in parameters and telling it to get items or update items or calling some specific method. When you're using the REST methodology, you're instead using the HTTP syntax and semantics to make that happen. So if you want to do a read, for example, if I want to just get items, I'm going to make an HTTP GET to a specific endpoint. So let's say we're calling the list service, so we'll call underscore API, we'll call web list, and we'll say, for example, get by title. Okay, and that'll be our method name. We're not saying, we could just call items. We don't have to call a method name, even though many of those method names are there. We can just ask for items, as I have in this scenario. Not read items, not get items, just items, because the get is telling the system to do a read. Okay? If you want to write an item, insert an item, you're going to do a post to write the item. So instead of calling a method that says insert item, you can just call item, give it a post, pass in the required information, it will do the operation for you. So semantically, it's a little bit different than you're used to doing in the past with web services. There are a couple of things you need to be aware of. Puts and deletes, posts and puts do almost the same thing, but they can be slightly different depending on the method implementation. Microsoft makes use of a non-standard, I know this is shocking, a non-standard operation called merge in their commands. They're trying to make it a first-class operation. It's not at the moment, so you won't always see that supported, and it's not in some of the specifications for REST. So if you've done REST on some other platforms, you wouldn't have used that verb before. What Microsoft uses it for is instead of doing a put that requires the whole amount of data to be posted, you can do a merge, which means you can do just portions of data for an item that you can post. For example, updating metadata instead of updating the entire item. This is a little bit confusing. OData and REST are two entirely different things. OData is the protocol specification. REST is how you actually implement that protocol. So if you're not familiar with OData, you can do some reading up on it. It gives you the query semantics, all the typing language and whatnot around the data feed. OData is a Microsoft construct. There's plenty of documentation out there for you to get familiar with it if you are not familiar with it. You will also see, and what's actually happening when OData is implemented, it's actually WCF data services. You'll see it used interchangeably a lot, especially in the TechNet documentation. So the actual way that Microsoft implements the OData protocol is via WCF data services in 2013 and in 2010. The way that you interact with SharePoint with REST is via the client service, okay, now also known as underscore API. This is the client object model that allows you to pass in all your operations. It knows how to process, talk to the server object model on your behalf on the back end, does all the Atom and JSON formatting for you to send you your responses. So anytime you're talking to SharePoint via REST, you're going to be talking to the client service across the various endpoints, which we used to call specifically via things like listdata.svc, and now we just call underscore API in the URL. So here's how it functions in the background. If you are going to create an item, you're going to construct a post. You're going to pass in the XML or the JSON that it requires to the client service. It's going to talk to the server object model and do what it needs to do on the back end. Reads are very simple. It's just an HTTP GET. And then an update or a delete, you can use the put, merge, and delete commands. So a couple of things where you need to be aware of how the semantics are a little bit different. If you pass in an object without all of the default fields, and for example, you do a put for a list item, and you don't specify all of the fields, it will put default values in those fields for you. If you specify all the fields, then obviously it'll take the fields that you specify. If you only want to update one column, for example, in an item, rather than constructing the entire item object, you can just update that field using the merge command. There's a bunch of documentation that Microsoft has produced for this with these wonderful squiggly graphs that tell you how all this stuff is supposed to work. Basically what this is giving you is how you're going to construct your calls. So this is what it looks like down here in an actual URL. So we're calling our site we're calling our possibly subsite, we're calling underscore API. Then we're looking for the resource path that we're after. In this case, I'm talking to the what would be the list data service, asking for items, and then I'm passing in my query and my options. So I'm saying get by ID, and here's how I want you to filter that out. Okay, and these can get fairly lengthy. You need to be aware of your 255 character limit in the URL when you're passing in when you're doing like long select statements, when you're working with search and stuff, some of those can get fairly lengthy. So be aware that there are some limitations around that. How you pass those in, that's what the little tube map up here is for, telling you how you can do an indexer, for example, which you could be doing here, and then when you're passing in methods and parameters and all that stuff. There's a big long document, I've got a link to it at the end that you can go through how all of that stuff functions.